Air travel is supposed to be a routine experience, a necessary part of life for millions of people who move between cities, countries, and continents every day. Airports are designed to handle large crowds efficiently, airlines work hard to maintain schedules, and passengers generally expect a certain level of professionalism and courtesy. But sometimes, the seemingly ordinary interactions that occur in this environment reveal the worst of human behavior, particularly when power, prejudice, and arrogance are involved. On that particular day, the airline staff's actions were a glaring example of how easily assumptions can cloud judgment, and how those assumptions can manifest in ways that are both subtle and painfully humiliating for the unsuspecting individual. He arrived at the airport early, carrying only a small, neatly packed bag, dressed in a simple yet elegant outfit that suggested professionalism without ostentation. To the casual observer, he might have appeared as just another traveler among thousands. But first impressions, as anyone who has ever navigated a crowded terminal knows, are often deceiving. The staff, tasked with checking passengers into the first-class cabin, cast glances at him that ranged from skeptical to downright dismissive. There was an unspoken question in the air: what business does this man have in first class? His calm demeanor, polite greetings, and courteous interactions with other passengers did little to alleviate the scrutiny he faced. The airline employees engaged in a series of subtle yet pointed actions designed to reinforce the hierarchy they assumed existed. Requests were delayed, explanations were given in a patronizing tone, and small inconveniences, seat assignments, baggage placement, boarding instructions, were handled with a sense of reluctant obligation rather than genuine professionalism. Each action, while seemingly minor on its own, contributed to a mounting sense of embarrassment and alienation. For someone accustomed to efficiency and respect, these small indignities carried a weight far heavier than the average passenger might imagine. It's important to understand that humiliation in such contexts rarely manifests as a single, dramatic event. It builds slowly, layer by layer, through the microaggressions that are often invisible to outsiders. A dismissive glance, a repeated correction, an overly formal or condescending tone, each of these elements chips away at a person's sense of dignity. And in a public setting, where other passengers observe interactions without fully understanding the underlying tensions, the experience can feel even more isolating. The airline staff's behavior was a textbook example of how assumptions about wealth, status, and identity can translate into actions that are simultaneously subtle and profoundly damaging. From the moment he approached the check-in counter, the airline's intention to shame him became apparent. They questioned his ticket class, repeatedly asking for documentation that was already in order. They made offhand remarks about seat availability and implied, through tone and body language, that perhaps he was in the wrong section entirely. Other passengers, many of whom were oblivious to the unfolding dynamics, glanced occasionally in his direction, sensing that something was off but not grasping the full context. Every interaction felt like a test, a deliberate attempt to assert control and reinforce a hierarchy that, in their minds, should have dictated his position on the plane. He remained composed, answering questions politely and providing all necessary documentation without protest. Yet beneath the calm exterior, he was acutely aware of the social dynamics at play. He recognized that the airline staff's behavior was not merely procedural, it was a calculated form of humiliation aimed at asserting their perceived superiority. They were treating him not as a valued passenger, but as someone who had overstepped an invisible boundary, someone whose presence in first class was, in their judgment, inappropriate. In this way, the airline attempted to wield shame as a tool of control, relying on the assumption that most people, when confronted with such treatment, would feel embarrassed, intimidated, and reluctant to challenge the authority of the staff. The airport environment itself amplified these dynamics. Airports are public spaces, but they are also arenas of observation, filled with people who carry their own expectations about behavior, decorum, and social order. The very act of being scrutinized in such a space, of having one's credentials questioned and one's right to occupy a particular space subtly challenged, can create an acute sense of vulnerability. This vulnerability is compounded when the actions of staff suggest that the shame being imposed is not accidental but intentional. Each delay, each pointed question, each condescending instruction was part of a larger narrative they sought to impose, that he did not belong in first class, that he was an outsider attempting to claim privileges that should be reserved for others. What makes this scenario particularly striking is that the airline staff's attempts at humiliation relied entirely on assumptions. They had no real knowledge of who he was, what he had achieved, or what authority he wielded. Yet their actions were confident, assertive, and performed with an air of superiority that suggested they believed their judgment to be infallible. This overconfidence is often the hallmark of humiliation in institutional settings. People act as if their perception alone can dictate social hierarchies, failing to consider that appearances can be deceiving. The irony, as will later become evident, is that the very assumptions that emboldened the airline staff would ultimately set the stage for a dramatic reversal, a moment in which their attempt to shame him would be turned on its head. The moment of revelation came with quiet inevitability, a subtle shift in the atmosphere that only he could sense. To the casual observer, he still appeared as just another passenger, calm and composed as he navigated the minor irritations of airport bureaucracy. Yet behind his polite smile and courteous exchanges was a presence of authority that could not be ignored. He was not just someone traveling first class, he was the CEO of a major company, a person whose influence, resources, and decision-making power shaped industries and affected thousands of lives. The revelation of his identity was not something he had sought to flaunt, nor was it something the airline staff could have predicted, but it was an invisible force that would soon redefine the dynamics of the entire interaction. He moved with the same ease and confidence that comes from years of leading a complex organization, making critical decisions under pressure, and commanding respect without demanding it. Each step he took through the airport corridor seemed purposeful, measured, and deliberate. There was an unspoken authority in the way he carried himself, in the way he interacted with fellow passengers, and even in the simple act of presenting his boarding pass with precise efficiency. These were not gestures of arrogance, they were the natural manifestations of someone accustomed to operating at a level of responsibility and accountability far beyond what the airline staff could immediately comprehend. The first signs of awareness among the airline staff were subtle. A glance lingered too long on his passport and boarding pass. Questions that had initially been asked with condescension now carried an undercurrent of hesitation, a recognition that perhaps this situation was not as straightforward as they had assumed. The staff had approached him with the confidence of someone certain of their social evaluation, believing that their judgment alone was sufficient to enforce the boundaries of first-class entitlement. But as the minutes passed, it became increasingly clear that their assumptions were unfounded, that their perceived superiority was entirely misplaced, and that they were dealing with someone whose real-world authority far exceeded their own. When he spoke, his voice was calm, controlled, and measured. There was no need for anger or confrontation, the power he held was inherent, and it required no dramatics to assert itself. Yet even the most subtle inflections in tone conveyed a sense of command that could not be ignored. The airline staff, who had been attempting to assert dominance through procedural authority, now found themselves confronted with a presence that was both unassailable and undeniable. They realized, perhaps too late, that their attempt to shame him had been built on a foundation of ignorance. The man they had dismissed as unworthy of first-class privileges was not only worthy but commanding respect on a scale they had never encountered. Other passengers, previously oblivious to the unfolding drama, began to notice the subtle change in the air. There was a shift in perception, an almost imperceptible recognition that something significant had changed. The passenger who had been treated with thinly veiled disdain was now radiating an authority that was impossible to ignore. The airline staff, once confident and composed, were now navigating the interaction with caution, attempting to mask their unease behind polite language and procedural explanations. Every step they took, every word they uttered, betrayed a growing awareness that they were no longer in control of the narrative. It is remarkable how quickly power dynamics can shift when the true identity of an individual is revealed. The airport, which had moments before been a stage for subtle humiliation, had transformed into an arena where authority, experience, and accomplishment carried far more weight than assumed social hierarchies. The CEO did not have to raise his voice, issue ultimatums, or engage in confrontation. The revelation of who he was, a leader of influence, a decision-maker of considerable scope, was sufficient to reshape the interaction entirely. Authority, in this case, was silent but absolute, a force that did not need to be asserted aggressively because it existed independently of the airline staff's perceptions. The contrast between appearance and reality was stark. The airline staff had relied on superficial cues, dress, demeanor, and perceived social status, to make judgments about who deserved respect and privilege. They had constructed an entire narrative in their minds about entitlement and hierarchy, one that was entirely disconnected from the actual facts. When confronted with the truth, that this seemingly ordinary passenger held extraordinary power, their constructed narrative collapsed. What had been assumed to be a display of their own control was revealed to be an illusion, fragile and dependent on ignorance. As he proceeded through the check-in process and toward the boarding gate, the CEO's presence became increasingly palpable. Each gesture, each interaction, carried the weight of someone accustomed to operating at the highest levels of responsibility. Staff members who had once questioned his right to occupy first class now found themselves deferring, consciously or unconsciously, to a presence they could no longer contest. The realization was inevitable: they were dealing with someone whose authority extended far beyond the confines of their immediate environment, someone whose influence could reshape decisions, affect policies, and command attention in ways that their training and experience had never prepared them for. The revelation of his identity was more than a personal vindication, it was a powerful demonstration of how superficial judgments can lead to profound miscalculations. The airline staff had attempted to shame him based on assumptions, relying on appearances and unverified perceptions to dictate behavior. They had not accounted for the possibility that their target of ridicule might wield influence far greater than their own. In that moment, the CEO's identity became both shield and instrument, a reminder that true authority does not require overt assertion but is recognized through competence, composure, and the undeniable weight of accomplishment. Humiliation often begins quietly, with a subtle accumulation of small actions that chip away at a person's sense of dignity. In this story, the initial attempts to demean and control him had been deliberate, calculated, and designed to make him feel small in a public setting. But the very forces attempting to enforce shame had unknowingly set the stage for a dramatic reversal. The moment of the unexpected twist was not abrupt or theatrical, it was a natural consequence of the collision between arrogance and true power, between assumption and reality. What the airline staff thought would be a straightforward imposition of authority quickly unraveled into a situation none of them had anticipated. He had endured the subtle slights, the condescending instructions, and the questioning of his legitimacy with composure. Every delay, every minor inconvenience, and every patronizing glance had been met with calm patience, but he had not been passive. In the background, he was observing, calculating, and preparing. There is a kind of quiet strength in people who have faced and overcome countless challenges in their professional lives, a strength that allows them to turn moments of adversity into opportunities for assertive action. By maintaining his composure, he created the perfect contrast to the staff's misplaced confidence, highlighting the disparity between perceived and actual power. The unexpected twist began with small signs that the balance of control was shifting. A question from an airline employee, intended to assert dominance, was met not with confusion or deference but with a perfectly poised response that revealed both competence and authority. It was the subtlety of these exchanges that magnified their impact. The staff had expected hesitation or embarrassment, but what they received was clarity, decisiveness, and confidence. Each correct response, each calm explanation, forced the staff to reconsider their initial judgments, shaking the foundation of the scenario they thought they controlled. Passengers in the vicinity, initially oblivious, began to sense the undercurrent of tension. There was a perceptible change in the atmosphere as those observing noticed that the man being challenged was not reacting in the expected way. He did not falter, he did not plead, and he did not resort to confrontation. Instead, he navigated the situation with the precision and assurance of someone accustomed to authority. The unexpected twist was not only a personal vindication but also a subtle public display, a revelation to all around him that appearances can be deceiving and that power can be understated yet absolute. The airline staff, who had confidently attempted to impose humiliation, began to display the first signs of unease. A frown appeared, a hesitant pause followed, and instructions were repeated unnecessarily as if to assert control that was slowly slipping away. Their earlier assumptions, rooted in appearances, assumptions about social status, and unfounded judgments, were collapsing in real time. They were beginning to understand, perhaps too late, that the passenger they had tried to shame was operating from a position of authority far beyond their comprehension, and that their own attempts at control were ineffective in the face of genuine power. What makes the twist so compelling is the inevitability of it in hindsight. The airline staff had created a situation in which they assumed the moral and procedural high ground, believing their judgment alone could dictate the rules of engagement. But in reality, they had ignored the simplest truth: true authority is not contingent upon appearances, and attempts to shame or belittle someone often fail spectacularly when that person possesses resources, influence, or composure far beyond the observer's imagination. The unexpected twist, then, is both a personal triumph and a broader commentary on human behavior, exposing how misplaced confidence and prejudice can lead to dramatic reversals. The dynamic shifted further during boarding. The moment the CEO approached the gate, there was a noticeable hesitation in the actions of the airline staff. Where once there had been certainty and authority, there was now caution, a subtle but undeniable acknowledgement that the balance of power had changed. Their previous confidence had been entirely performative, reliant on assumptions and appearances, whereas the CEO's authority was inherent, recognized instantly, and impossible to ignore. The twist was complete. The staff who had sought to shame him were now navigating interactions with careful deference, aware that the earlier dynamics had been fundamentally flawed. Each interaction from this point forward reinforced the shift. The staff, realizing the miscalculation, attempted to recover control through procedural correctness, but their actions were hollow and reactive rather than assertive. They were responding to a situation that had already changed, trying to assert influence in a scenario where they no longer held the upper hand. The CEO, by contrast, required no theatrical gestures. The revelation of his competence, his identity, and his authority had already redefined the relationship. In this subtle, almost imperceptible way, the unexpected twist magnified its impact, demonstrating that true power often operates silently and with precision. What makes this story resonate is the universality of its lesson. People frequently attempt to shame, judge, or diminish others based on incomplete information or superficial cues. These actions, when aimed at the wrong person, can backfire spectacularly. The twist in this scenario is not merely situational, it is moral and psychological. It exposes the fragility of assumptions, the dangers of misplaced confidence, and the way in which calm authority can neutralize attempts at humiliation. The unexpected reversal highlights the importance of perspective and the consequences of underestimating others, serving as a compelling reminder that appearances are not always reality, and that power, when genuine, commands respect without the need for overt assertion. Through these moments, the narrative demonstrates the delicate interplay between perception and reality. The airline staff, operating under the illusion of control, misjudged the situation entirely. The CEO, maintaining poise and responding with clarity, transformed what could have been a moment of public embarrassment into a powerful demonstration of authority and dignity. Each small victory in these exchanges, polite but firm responses, quiet confidence, strategic patience, contributed to the larger narrative, ensuring that the twist was both complete and undeniable. The unexpected nature of the twist, combined with the inevitability of its outcome once all facts were known, is what gives this story its tension, drama, and ultimate satisfaction. Once the balance of power began to shift, it became increasingly clear that the CEO was no longer a passive participant in the events unfolding at the airport. Every moment of hesitation from the airline staff, every condescending glance or misjudged action, was an opportunity for him to assert control, not through aggression, but through presence, intellect, and strategic action. The staff had assumed that their authority, backed by procedural rules and superficial assessments of passengers, would suffice to dominate the interaction. They had underestimated the subtlety of true leadership, which does not rely on loud declarations or overt force but on a calm, measured command of the environment and the people within it. As he approached the boarding gate, his movements were deliberate, exuding the quiet confidence of someone who understood both the value of patience and the power of timing. He had already observed the staff, their tendencies, their weaknesses, and the patterns in which they attempted to assert dominance. Every smile they gave, every repeated instruction, and every minor correction became part of a larger narrative he was carefully crafting in his mind. Unlike the staff, whose actions were reactive and driven by assumptions, his approach was proactive, methodical, and purposeful. This was the essence of control, to act not out of impulse, but with calculated intent, ensuring that each step reinforced his position and gradually shifted the dynamic in his favor. One of the most powerful aspects of asserting control in such a public environment is the ability to maintain composure while subtly changing the rules of engagement. The CEO's calm demeanor forced the airline staff to respond in ways they had not anticipated, eroding their confidence with every polite, precise, and unflappable interaction. Where they expected hesitation or embarrassment, they found clarity and decisiveness. Where they expected submission, they encountered authority that was recognized instinctively, even if not immediately acknowledged. The passengers around them, who had initially been unaware of the tension, began to pick up on the subtle signals of dominance shifting, creating an almost tangible shift in the atmosphere of the terminal. As the interaction continued, the CEO began to take control in ways that were both strategic and psychologically impactful. He used information, calm speech, and body language to subtly guide the staff's responses, creating a scenario in which they were reacting to his moves rather than the other way around. This is a hallmark of true authority. It does not need to assert itself through volume or intimidation but establishes dominance by influencing the behavior of others and setting the pace for interactions. Each carefully chosen word, each deliberate gesture, served to reinforce the shift from a scenario where he was being humiliated to one where he was directing the course of events. The staff, increasingly aware that their initial strategy had failed, attempted to regain control, but their actions were clumsy and reactive. They were operating on the basis of assumptions and rules that no longer applied to the situation. The CEO, on the other hand, remained calm and deliberate, turning each of their moves into opportunities to reinforce his authority. Every delay they attempted, every unnecessary instruction, was neutralized by his measured responses, leaving them frustrated and increasingly uncertain. This psychological aspect of control, the ability to influence the perceptions and reactions of others, is often overlooked, but in this context, it was decisive. Passengers observing the interactions could see the transformation taking place. What had started as a scene in which one man was subtly humiliated had evolved into a situation where he commanded the room without raising his voice. There was a quiet magnetism to the way he carried himself, a presence that demanded attention and respect. The contrast between his calm authority and the staff's growing unease amplified the impact of his control, creating a public demonstration of the reversal that had taken place. The narrative had shifted from one of assumed superiority to one of undeniable influence, and the shift was visible to anyone paying attention. The CEO's method of taking control was not overtly confrontational. He did not raise his voice or create scenes. Instead, he used precision, timing, and the natural respect commanded by his presence to subtly reshape the situation. Each interaction was an exercise in psychological strategy, turning the staff's attempts to assert dominance into opportunities for him to guide the encounter. This kind of control requires patience, intelligence, and a deep understanding of human behavior. It is not the kind of authority that can be replicated by force or intimidation. It is rooted in respect, competence, and an unshakable self-assurance that signals to others that they are no longer the ones directing the outcome. By the time boarding began, the CEO had fully established control over the scenario. The staff, who had initially attempted to shame and dominate him, were now deferential, careful, and visibly uneasy. He had turned their strategy on its head, demonstrating the consequences of underestimating someone based on superficial judgments. The environment, once designed to reinforce their authority, had become a stage on which he could assert his own, subtle yet absolute, dominance. His every move, every word, and every gesture reinforced the new dynamic, ensuring that the balance of power had irrevocably shifted. The transformation of the interaction highlights a key aspect of human dynamics. Control is not always about loud or aggressive actions, it is often about presence, perception, and the ability to influence others' behavior without force. The CEO's control was complete because it was quiet, deliberate, and psychologically informed. He was able to turn a potentially humiliating experience into an exercise in authority, demonstrating that true control is recognized and respected, even when it is exercised subtly. Every micro-interaction, the timing of his responses, the clarity of his instructions, the confidence in his posture, served to reinforce the shift, creating a scenario in which the staff's initial strategy had completely failed and the CEO had become the unquestioned master of the situation. Restoring justice and respect is rarely a matter of confrontation alone. It is often the result of a carefully orchestrated series of actions that reclaim authority, dignity, and control. In this story, the CEO's journey from being targeted for humiliation to taking command of the situation demonstrates precisely how respect can be restored when one is underestimated, judged unfairly, or treated with condescension. The airline staff, who had assumed that their superficial judgments and procedural authority were sufficient to impose shame, were now confronted with a reality they could not ignore. Their attempts to belittle someone had not only failed but had been transformed into a public lesson in accountability and awareness. Every interaction that had initially contributed to the CEO's humiliation now became an opportunity to reclaim respect. The subtle delays, the condescending instructions, the unnecessary questioning, all of it was neutralized through calm authority, strategic responses, and the undeniable presence of someone accustomed to leadership. The restoration of respect is not achieved by aggression or retaliation alone, it is achieved through composure, intelligence, and the ability to demonstrate competence and authority in a way that cannot be dismissed. Each polite but firm correction, each measured clarification, was a building block in reconstructing the social and psychological balance that had been disturbed. One of the most striking aspects of this reclamation of respect was its subtlety. It was not theatrical, it was not loud, and it did not rely on dramatic gestures. Instead, the CEO allowed his competence, his authority, and his calm command of the situation to speak for him. The airline staff, once confident and assertive, found themselves responding to his lead rather than dictating terms. This shift, though quiet, was profound. It demonstrated that true respect is earned not through domination or intimidation, but through a combination of skill, presence, and the ability to navigate complex social dynamics with grace and precision. The passengers around the scene became inadvertent witnesses to the restoration of justice. Those who had initially observed the staff's condescending treatment now saw a different dynamic unfold. The man who had been subtly humiliated was now commanding attention, not through anger or spectacle, but through measured, deliberate actions that communicated authority and integrity. The respect he reclaimed was not only personal, it was public. Observers could see, understand, and appreciate the reversal, which magnified its impact and served as a lesson in the consequences of misplaced assumptions and prejudice. Restoring respect also required the CEO to manage the psychological dynamics of the situation carefully. The airline staff, caught in the realization that their attempts at humiliation had failed, were beginning to experience the subtle pressures of accountability. He did not need to explicitly confront them or accuse them of wrongdoing. His mere presence, combined with precise, assertive communication, forced them to acknowledge the imbalance they had created. This is a key principle in restoring respect. The target of mistreatment does not have to seek revenge through overt confrontation. The restoration can occur organically through controlled actions that highlight competence, authority, and self-assuredness. The restoration of justice in this scenario was further reinforced by the CEO's ability to maintain control over the narrative. He allowed the staff to see, in real time, that their assumptions had been flawed and that their attempts at humiliation were ineffective. This approach ensured that respect was not simply regained internally, but also externally, in the eyes of everyone witnessing the situation. By demonstrating composure, intelligence, and authority, he effectively rewrote the social script that had initially placed him in a position of vulnerability. The staff, once positioned as arbiters of social order, were now compelled to acknowledge the legitimacy of his authority, completing the cycle of restoration. The subtle public reclaiming of respect is particularly powerful because it undermines the initial humiliation without resorting to antagonism or aggression. The CEO's approach highlights that restoring respect often involves demonstrating capability, confidence, and integrity in the face of adversity. It requires patience, strategic observation, and the ability to anticipate the reactions of others. Each action taken to restore respect was calculated to reinforce authority without escalating conflict, creating a scenario where the initial imbalance was corrected smoothly and effectively. Moreover, the restoration of respect is deeply psychological. It involves shifting the perceptions of both the offenders and the observers. The staff had to reconcile their initial judgments with the reality of the CEO's identity, competence, and authority. Passengers and onlookers, who might have initially assumed that he was at fault or less deserving of first-class treatment, now recognized the reversal. This public acknowledgement amplifies the effect, ensuring that respect is not merely personal but also socially reinforced. In this way, the act of reclaiming dignity serves a dual purpose. It restores internal confidence while also reshaping external perceptions, creating a comprehensive restoration of justice. The CEO's restoration of respect also underscores the importance of timing and strategy. He did not act impulsively, nor did he seek immediate confrontation. Instead, he observed, calculated, and responded in ways that gradually but decisively shifted the dynamic in his favor. This methodical approach ensured that the restoration was complete, leaving no doubt about the reversal of power. The airline staff, initially confident and dismissive, had to confront the reality that their actions had not achieved the intended effect. Each interaction, each moment of calm authority, further solidified the CEO's reclaimed position, transforming a potentially humiliating experience into a demonstration of dignity, power, and strategic acumen. The lesson that no one should be underestimated is a thread running quietly but powerfully through this story, one that gains intensity as the narrative unfolds. From the very beginning, the airline staff had relied on superficial judgments, appearance, demeanor, and perceived social standing, to form an opinion about who they were dealing with. They assumed that this passenger, though in first class, was just another traveler, someone who could be subtly shamed or controlled to fit the airline's imagined social hierarchy. What they failed to recognize was that their assumptions, however confident they seemed, were dangerously flawed. People, like the CEO in this story, are often far more than they appear on the surface, and underestimating them can have consequences that are both immediate and irreversible. Throughout the early interactions, it was apparent that the staff's judgment was clouded by biases and assumptions. They relied on cues that had nothing to do with actual authority or capability, misreading calmness for hesitation, simplicity for ignorance, and politeness for submission. Each microaggression, each delay, each condescending instruction was an attempt to assert dominance over someone they considered inferior. Yet in reality, these assumptions expose their vulnerability. When people judge others without understanding the depth of their experience, competence, or influence, they set themselves up for miscalculation. The CEO's composed responses, precise actions, and quiet confidence began to highlight this misjudgment, turning the situation into a subtle but powerful lesson. The significance of not underestimating someone lies in the unpredictable ways authority, intelligence, and experience can manifest. The CEO did not need to argue, confront, or create a scene. His presence alone, combined with measured and competent actions, gradually shifted the entire dynamic. The staff, confident in their power, were suddenly navigating interactions without the certainty they had initially assumed. Their earlier attempts at humiliation were exposed as ineffective, and the passenger they had underestimated now commanded the situation. This contrast underscores the danger of relying solely on appearances to assess someone's capabilities or social worth. The principle of underestimation becomes even more striking when viewed in a public context. Airports are spaces full of observers who often silently form opinions based on surface-level observations. The airline staff had assumed that their subtle attempts at control would be effective, not realizing that the passengers' true authority would soon become apparent to everyone present. As the CEO responded with clarity, calmness, and assertive politeness, the onlookers began to witness a reversal of roles. The lesson here extends beyond the individual interaction. Underestimating someone not only risks personal embarrassment but can also lead to a public demonstration of misjudgment. Timing and strategic action play a crucial role in demonstrating the consequences of underestimation. The CEO did not immediately reveal his identity or assert dominance aggressively. Instead, he allowed the staff's assumptions to guide their behavior, observing and analyzing the situation. He used this observation to respond with precision, correcting misconceptions subtly and steering the interactions toward a reversal of authority. This strategy shows that underestimating someone is rarely a neutral mistake. It creates opportunities for the underestimated person to reclaim control, redefine the narrative, and assert influence in ways that are calculated, measured, and highly effective. Another element of this lesson is the psychological impact on those who underestimated him. Confidence that had initially driven their attempts at humiliation began to waver as they realized their judgments were flawed. The subtle shifts in body language, the hesitations in speech, and the growing awareness that they were no longer in control all pointed to the consequences of underestimation. By the time the CEO fully asserted his authority, the staff were operating in a reactive mode, trying to navigate the scenario without the certainty they had relied upon. This demonstrates how misjudging someone's abilities can quickly erode perceived power, leaving those who made the mistake in a vulnerable position. The broader implication of this lesson extends beyond a single interaction at an airport. In business, leadership, and everyday life, underestimating others based on superficial judgments can lead to missed opportunities, poor decisions, and reputational damage. True authority, competence, and influence are not always immediately visible. They may reside beneath calm exteriors, understated confidence, or polite demeanor. The CEO in this story exemplifies this principle, showing that the most significant power often lies in what is not immediately apparent to those relying on assumptions. Moreover, the narrative illustrates that underestimation often invites a natural form of accountability. By assuming the passenger lacked authority, the staff created conditions that allowed the CEO to demonstrate the consequences of their misjudgment in real time. Each precise response, each calm assertion of competence, and each subtle act of control reinforce the lesson that people who are underestimated are often positioned to demonstrate authority and capability in ways that leave a lasting impact. It is a lesson about respect, awareness, and the dangers of superficial judgment, highlighting the human tendency to rely on appearances rather than substance. The cumulative effect of underestimation in this story is profound. What began as a minor attempt to impose social hierarchy and shame someone perceived as lesser evolved into a full reversal, where authority, competence, and respect were reclaimed decisively. The CEO's actions, which were deliberate, measured, and strategic, transformed the scenario from one of potential humiliation to one of undeniable dominance and restored dignity. This transformation serves as a powerful reminder that underestimating someone is not a neutral act. It is a misstep that can have immediate consequences, reshaping interactions, social perception, and the distribution of authority in ways that are both visible and lasting. Through this entire sequence, the central lesson is clear: never underestimate a person based on appearances, assumptions, or biases. The consequences are not limited to immediate embarrassment for those making the mistake. They extend to public perception, organizational dynamics, and the broader recognition of authority and competence. The CEO's measured responses, calm presence, and strategic assertiveness illustrate that true power does not need to be flaunted to be effective. Underestimation, in contrast, exposes vulnerabilities, miscalculations, and the potential for dramatic reversal, highlighting the enduring importance of recognizing the full scope of a person's capabilities.